students who are also involved with putting everything on today. I'd like to thank Paula as well for her work in putting together today's events, and Michelle Murphy, our keynote speaker, who we'll hear from later today. Our panel is called Platforms and Power, and what we want to address is the fact that platforms and algorithms play increasing roles in our everyday lives and everyday events, whether it's applying for jobs using a platform and having those CVs sorted by certain algorithms, whether it's in the realm of entertainment, where we use platforms increasingly to access cultural and entertainment content, whether it's in terms of replicating or disrupting the hierarchies of the star system in entertainment, whether it's in politics and the ways that political communications and activist communications are mediated and really transforming the ways that activism and politics are carried out. Whether it's our social relations and our international relations, from the micro level to the macro level, all of these things are increasingly mediated by platforms. And so today our question is really, how should platforms and algorithms be held to account? And what can researchers do? What role can researchers play in holding platforms to account and in transforming platform power? Today I'm here on this panel with Professor Leslie Regan Shade from the iSchool at U of T, who's going to moderate today's panel for us. There are two panelists who weren't able to join us today in person, Merlina Lim from Carleton and Nasma Ahmed from the Digital Justice Lab will help us to carry the conversation forward, and we're unfortunately unable to join in person today, but they are part of this initiative as well. What I want to do is start off this panel by asking everybody to introduce themselves, and at the same time, we've got the kind of questions for the panel today on the screen, and maybe at the same time as we introduce ourselves, we could say a few words about the first question. What is timely about research on platforms, power, right now? So who would like to start? Well, I will. Okay.
We can just go down that way.
We'll go that way.
We'll go that way.
Okay,
so
we'll go that way.
Take about 5 minutes each or so for each.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. My research has been for a long time on copyright, but now I've been kind of moving sort of newly into research on platforms, particularly Netflix recommendations, and also privacy and Facebook and platforms. And one of the things that's kind of not timely about research on platforms is some of the privacy research. It's kind of like, after the tub's been overflowing for 4 years, it's good to find out and turn off the taps, but it's also too late in some ways. And at the same time, it's not too late. It's not too late to take note of what uses data is being put to rethink, as I hope we'll sort of talk about some more a little bit later on the panel, researchers' relationship with data and the proper uses of a lot of personal data that's become available to researchers, both as a part of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but also something that we all need to grapple with broadly. And so I think discussing and analyzing and coming to terms with the use of personal data and big data by researchers and also just by platforms more broadly, that kind of intervention I think is very timely.
I'm Leslie Shade at Faculty of Information, University of Toronto. And I've been, studying and looking at the social and policy aspects of the internet, or ICT, since I started my PhD in 1991 at McGill. That's the getting older there. in that sense, looking at gender and the internet. And so I've been in this sort of policy space in Canada for many, many years, and often I think that what's happening now, we were talking about in the 1990s, and things have gotten even worse. They haven't resolved if we're talking about digital divides, digital inclusion, communication rights, and whatnot. So I teach these classes in the faculty, interdisciplinary faculty, where we do have a lot of computer scientists and young people that are into UX design and want to grow up and be data scientists and whatnot. And I'm teaching in the critical information policy study stream. So a lot of my research is looking at, in particular, actually a lot of the privacy issues around young people today in terms of conceptualizing how they're using social and mobile media. And for me, I've been RAD this last couple months, which is a recovering associate dean. So it's been really great. So I've been able to kind of get back into the research, but I've been diving into a lot of the tech regulation literature that's coming out from the EU and the UK and some of Canada, and notice with great interest Daniel Tarian's press conference last week with the Privacy Commissioner of BC about, I was going to say firing Zuckerberg, but that's not it, but suing him because there's no other way that there can be recourse in Canada under privacy laws. Sara, by the way, wrote a fantastic policy options piece that I stumbled across called "Why We Should Regulate Facebook." Right? Was that what it was called?
I did not write the headline, but that
okay.
was.
But yes, I stumbled across that last night. So if we're asking what sort of timely or pressing now, I think it's all to do with this sort of idea of to regulate or not to regulate or how to regulate. If you think back in 1999 with the CRTC new media hearings, they were like, we're not going to regulate the internet because it's alphanumeric text. We can't possibly do that. Well, okay, things have certainly shifted. Then you get the Zuck who wants to, I'm going to regulate. We're going to do privacy stuff because he's trying to get ahead of the game. Woof. So who are the stakeholders? Who are the players? And it's not just social media. It's huge stuff about ethics around artificial intelligence, issues of data discrimination, intersectionality perspectives, and all of that. I think we're in a really exciting period of time right now. Things to look forward to. It's an election year in Canada, so who knows what's going to happen there. ISND is supposed to release a digital and data strategy report soon. I've been in touch with media relations persons there, and they've done a fulsome consultation, but we haven't seen anything yet that's come out of that, and it will be very interesting in the coming weeks to see what they come up with in terms of their strategy and what issues they're going to prioritize. So I just think in terms of the sort of regulatory space and different stakeholders thinking about how we do this, it's just going to be really interesting. And it was only a year ago GDPR came on, so right, what's going to happen next year?
Thanks.
Tamara.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. I'm Tamara Shepard. I'm at the University of Calgary in the Department of Communication, Media, and Film. And similar to Leslie, who was my PhD advisor, so full disclosure here, I also am concerned about the regulatory aspects of platforms and algorithms. And speaking of these changes coming in Canada, there's also a review of the Act, so a review of the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Acts, which will be interesting to see if that at all takes into account the ways that platforms are reshaping our telecoms and broadcasting systems in Canada from the perspective of, what I'm really interested in is this sort of idea of platform imperialism. So the fact that most of the large platforms that we use are based in the US and what that means for Canadian regulation. As you noted, Leslie, the OPC is struggling, Office of the Privacy Commissioner, struggling with how to regulate Facebook because there's not that much they can do really. And then at the same time, I'm really fascinated by Zuckerberg as a sort of like totemic character. There's all kinds of amazing Zuckerberg memes on Reddit, if you go in there, that suggest that he's actually a lizard wearing a human mask, and that could be true. I find Zuckerberg really fascinating as a sort of not just a figurehead for these sorts of like Silicon Valley ideologies, but also as like a political figure. And there's all these ways that he's, of course, trying to position himself politically by doing these tours of the country and whatever, and now calling for regulation of his own platform. But at the same time, his board want him out, right? Because he's got the largest voting share of Facebook, and all of the rest of the board want him gone because they find him to be a tyrannical ruler. So I think this is really fascinating as well. My research right now, my major project right now, is more looking at Canadian regulation and the history of Canadian internet regulation. So like you said, these questions from the 1990s just keep coming back over and over again in each successive consultation in potentially new language, but essentially the same questions. And so I'm really fascinated about how those questions come to get on the agenda and how they get taken up at certain moments and not at others. So that's sort of what I'm working on right now.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Rena Bivens, and I'm at Carleton University. And I guess I mostly work at trying to understand how identity categories are shaped by software. And so identity-based programming is something that's super interesting to me. And so it's software more where I'm coming from, and which is kind of, you know, at the core of these platforms, however you might define them, in these digital spaces. So how is that software creating, like producing a social infrastructure of sorts? And so my work's looked at how there's different layers of software, there's shifting levels of visibility, but each structure shapes identity in different ways. And so I've looked at Facebook, for instance, and assessed how they've coded gender over a 10-year period. And it's fascinating history to it in that, you know, they don't necessarily ask for gender and don't force you to answer that question when they first come out with that software, right? So you can start to imagine like what they think this software is for, like no real understanding of Zuck, the lizard, whatever, of where this is heading, right? But over time, of course, like gender is just still such a monumental thing in the advertising world, in so many worlds. And so over time, as we know on the user interface, something that we can sense better, that we can understand better when it comes to software, and that's another thing I'm really interested in. There's so many different options where you can identify your gender, but still how they code that in the database is fascinating to me because they effectively return everyone to a binary based on the forced pronoun selection. So it's just a different way, like they opened it up and said, you know, there's lots of different ways of identifying. We hear you, you know, and maybe in a similar way to the regulation stuff. Like, we hear you, we're responding. But I'm super interested in the capacity of software specifically to hide and obfuscate different levels of control and different ways of formulating identity. And when I talked to them about this in particular, they were saying they didn't want to break the product for their clients, right? So their advertisers, their third-party clients who rely on data and targeting. So it's super interesting to me. I've looked at lots of other social media platforms as well. And when you put on like an advertiser's hat and you try and figure out what targeting options are available, and then you compare that to things like what they're asking the user to enter, sometimes, you know, they're inferring information about you even though you're not entering it, just to be able to provide that data to advertisers. And so that flow is super interesting to me, and how it morphs, and how users don't really know how they're identified to other people, like the advertisers and third-party clients, and how that also doesn't even match up with the privacy policies. Like the categories on Twitter just blew my mind. I had to stare at the wall for a while after I looked at like what are all the ways that you can target people on Twitter, and having read their privacy policies, and was like this, and where's the accountability there? But there's lots of stuff I'm interested in that zone. I've also been looking at apps and apps designed to prevent sexual violence, and so looking at it as kind of a field, like what is this technological solutionism about? When we identify a problem and say, you know, let's throw technology at that and that will solve it. And so that's another thing that really bothers me, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room understand, of course, that, you know, technical and social, there's no real meaningful way of separating them out completely. And so it's really interesting to me to see how these technical solutions are applied and what kinds of values and norms are embedded in all the software that's developed. And then I guess I would say that speculative design is something that I'm working with now. And so I'm really keen to not just point out all of these problems, but try and imagine different ways of thinking about them. And so when it comes to software and the problems that we're addressing today, I'm really interested in how we can get more people to see that software is something that we can take part in, that is structuring our lives, but that it isn't so far away. It's not just in Silicon Valley. It's not just that tech expert, that computer programmer who understands it and who can resolve it. It's not just Zuckerberg. It's in control of it. But how do we better sense software in our lives, and how do we shift that relationship around? And so, I guess moving on to what's most pressing and timely right now. I know in the introduction it was mentioned that platforms can be widely defined, and I just saw also, I think it was yesterday, Sara Sharma and who else was it, came out with a piece. Hello, that was great. I just read that, Platform Uncommons in Feminist Media Studies. It's a really great piece exploring, platform feminism, which I guess is something that you've been working on a lot. And so also how, platforms can be many different kinds of things. It doesn't have to be this specifically digital thing that's rooted in software. So what kinds of platforms connect folks in ones that aren't necessarily mainstream, aren't necessarily digital, that aren't necessarily well known, but how they are actors in the radicalization of white supremacists too. And so whiteness is something that I feel is super important to think through here. I'll stop there.
Great. Hi, I'm Christina Baade. I'm here at McMaster University in the Communication Studies and Multimedia Department. My research follows sort of two big streams. One is the intersection between music and radio and sort of sound media more broadly defined, sort of going from a very historical kind of place and archivally based to look at how sort of belonging and nation and sort of policy work together to sort of like identify particular audiences as well as particular performers in terms of genre, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of nation. And then, this is stuff that is like I've drilled down in, say, World War II or in the late 1930s or in the 50s and 60s. The other sort of line of research is looking at particular performers. And this, of course, comes from the fact that I'm located, probably my biggest home is in popular music studies. And so I'm interested in, I sort of reluctantly kind of went into the realm of focusing on particular stars and particular locations, not simply as a way of interrogating sort of concepts of stardom, but also as looking at how individuals sort of negotiating, sort of shifting popular music and entertainment economies. So I have a historical project looking at Dame Farrell, who has still alive at 102 and has had a very, very long, 70 decade or 90 decade or so career. And looking at really how she's negotiating that. Also negotiating aspects of gender and sort of middle of the road, which often sort of falls through the cracks in popular music historiography. And then my other project, because you also have to do contemporary things to feed your soul, is on Beyonce and stardom and sort of certainly the ways that she's negotiated the sort of shifting terrains of digital music. And that really brings me up to the fact that, as somebody who's paying attention, you can't help but notice the crisis the music industry was in the early 21st century, and the way in the past 9 or 10 years, streaming services have really come out as being the solution to the problems of the music industry. And so, and that of course is what kind of hinges me into this panel on platforms. So I'm very interested in the ways that we went from a discourse of music industry in crisis in that first 10 years or so, from say Napster to, I guess to the sort of, the glory of iTunes, when we were sort of paying for, singles downloads, album downloads, and then we moved over into the solution was made, and where streaming platforms, early ones like Songza, Pandora, began to recognize that it wasn't so much about helping people access particular kinds of music and sort of, negotiating those gigantic databases of music that you would have if, in the sort of like more piracy kind of based culture, but that it was about, offering a really sort of smooth user interface. And that, of course, is pulling on, to my radio-based mind, to the logics of radio. The logics of that people are not so much interested in, tracing discovery of particular artists and bands and songs, maybe that probably, I would imagine the number of people in this room, the percentage of people in this room for whom that is actually a way that you engage in your music online is probably larger than the broader population. And once they sort of had that window into, what we would say that, radio formats had fully discovered by the end of the 1970s, that, you want a type of music, you want music to match a mood. You could go back earlier to mood music records of the sort of 1950s and 60s, or the Edison sort of mood, music sort of studies of the 1920s and 30s. Then we begin to see where the streaming platforms really take off. And so what I'm very interested in as looking at the way that streaming platforms have come to seem at it, especially for those of us who have access to broadband and Wi-Fi, as the sort of, the go-to easy using way to access music. And just curious, how many of you have some sort of a streaming app on your phone? So, I mean, obviously, again, population that is probably more likely, considering the issues of the digital divide, to use this. And so I'm very interested in both the way that these operate as platforms, in those questions of end user that we have brought to bear on the range of other platforms, where of course our data is being used and harnessed, and we're actually being used as sort of product placement tests for bands. The ways that the investors in many of these apps are actually part of artist development companies and companies that are interested in sort of, like testing, like what songs should we actually do for the singles release. But also the impact that it has on the livelihoods of musicians, which is another deep concern of mine. And of course, anybody who is, maybe sort of moderately been paying attention knows that the sort of streaming fee that an artist gets for a single play is something like 0.00018, something like that. And that's, and this of course is based on sort of the logics of sort of radio play and radio licensing. And, so in many ways what's happening as these stations are coming through notice my sort of radio residual sort of discourse here, as these platforms are coming through, is they're having to negotiate sort of earlier practices of copyright, which are of course laden with ways that gender and race and genre are sort of layered into popular music, and who, the always terrible contracts that artists have gotten. Somebody like Matt Stahl has certainly written about, beautifully in his work on contracts. And the ways that, in many ways, that sort of techno-optimistic way of talking about the internet as a way for, artists to reach fans sort of seamlessly has really, in many ways, things like Spotify have not saved artists. They've saved the recording industry. And the ways that artists then have to sort of, leverage a whole series of different kinds of platforms to reach audiences, to negotiate how they're going to, get onto playlists on Spotify. In many ways, many of the things that were used, that radio regulations and notions of the public good that were used to regulate radio are not, brought to bear upon streaming platforms. And so we have, this. It's not just a move from a product-based to a service-based industry in music economies, but it's also moving into a sort of different regulatory kind of realm. And sort of more recently, we've certainly seen this in the ways that, say, Spotify has appealed the new U.S. copyright guidelines that have raised the fees for streaming, because of course that is, the give and take of their entire industry base, or the sort of ways that music publishers have sort of challenged streaming services even as they're moving into new markets. Most recently, India, which is Spotify is bragging about on their website. It's 2 million, new potential users right there, which of course is very good for its advertising as well as the sale of the data it's getting from the users. So I'm really interested in the impact that it has on musicians and their livelihood in this sort of newly stabilized but still very bad for musicians music economy, as well as the impact that it has on those of us who use these services, especially because those services, as Eric Drott has pointed out, are very good at marketing our musical tastes as being particularly revealing about our identity. So building on those old concepts of the links between, taste demographics and the ways particular tastes are, celebrated or denigrated are sort of, carrying over into these services. So I'm really interested into how these current discourses are layered on top of all of these deeply unequal and problematic ways that we have had of structuring or thinking about music and the people who make it and the people who listen to it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Andrea Zeffiro, and I'm in the Department of Communication Studies and Multimedia here at McMaster University. And in very broad terms, I think my research is concerned with establishing counter-narratives to contemporary data paradigms along what I've identified as 3 F's of data. And so these are failure, futurity, and friction. And failure is really about looking at the failures of data infrastructures. So I've looked at glitches and breaches to look at the ways in which modes of inequality and injustice circulate in these systems. So the first case study had to do with forms of digital labor and looked at the ScanOps, who were a group of a labor force in the Googleplex that were responsible for digitizing millions of texts. And so I kind of put together this, what I've called an ephemeral glitch archive that tells the counter story of the Google Books project through these workers that are otherwise hidden and embedded in this larger infrastructure, which we're asked to embrace as fail-safe in many ways, or devoid of human intervention. So that's the first area of failure. The second one, futurity, builds on Lee Edelman's work on reproductive futurism, and so I'm thinking about how data is used as a political trope, and how we're asked to embrace this idea that if we just provide more data or have more data, that the future will be that much better, that it will be brighter, and provide us with more agency. And the last area, friction, in part started as an assessment of where we were in terms of research ethics and looking at data ethics in university context. And so some of the work there looks at what I've called these negotiated relationships that researchers encounter when we're doing social media research in particular. And so I'm looking at how there's this constant negotiation between the researcher, between REBs, platforms, and participants, and how this kind of one-size-fits-all idea about ethics just can't possibly apply to these evolving research domains. And so kind of leading out of there, and to address the question that Sara asked, what I've also been thinking about lately has to do with the way that ethics is now a buzzword and a strategic trend in big tech. And it seems to me that the word ethics or the rhetoric of ethics has also superseded transparency as a key term and concept. And I'm sure even Tamara can, the Zuck loves, to talk about transparency. And so I think ethics like transparency will be co-opted by big tech. Like over the last few years, we witnessed how the word was used by industry to signal a commitment to disclosing this limited range of back-end operations and an openness to public scrutiny. So the example of like Facebook released its ad transparency tools, and these tools revealed the amount of advertising activity carried out on the platform, but without actually making transparent how the ads operate on the platform. And at the same time, consumers were still being asked to submit to these opaque and malleable terms of service. And so it's the antithesis of transparency. And so what I'm getting at is I think like these contradictory practices amounted to a kind of transparency theater, right? If you think about the security theater. So I think that, my sense is now with a turn to ethics, what we may encounter is an ethics washing or an ethics theater in the same way, that we're being provided with this feeling that there's an interest in ethics while doing little or nothing at all. So I think that's sort of where I'll be going with things today.
Okay. Does any panelists want to say anything about what anybody else said? No? I've been busy taking notes. So I just want to wrap up part of this section because as everybody's been talking, I've been thinking that there's a sort of series of keywords, and yes, we can think of keywords in the Raymond Williams sense, and you know, we can create, you know, our own collection of keywords, but there's a lot of interesting keywords that have been come up here. One is regulation. One is platform imperialism. Another is data discrimination. Now, this wasn't mentioned as a keyword per se, but as Tamara was talking, I thought about this whole idea of philanthrocapitalism. You know, you've got this San Francisco General Hospital that is now the Zuckerberg-Chan Hospital and whatnot. Identity and or identity categories, social infrastructure, obfuscation, public good, we've got ethics, we've got transparency. Did I say technological solutionism? No, I didn't get there. Technological solutionism, speculative design, streaming, end users. I always found that a funny term. Copyright. I mentioned public good because it's interesting. Public good, public interest, that sort of digital labor. We're all talking about different facets of digital labor. Friction. Did anybody use friction-free capitalism? I don't know. Stuff like that. So all of these sorts of interesting, nobody mentioned. Did anybody mention innovation? Right? And that sort of ad nauseum discourse of innovation. Did anybody mention the word that all the techies and the policymakers love? It begins with D, disruption. It's got 3 syllables. Disruption, right? Yeah. So, are there any keywords you think I've missed in terms of how people have copyright? You talked about copyright. I didn't put copyright down there.
I think you have given a comprehensive.
Okay. Okay.
Why don't we do that after the next?
Okay. So after the next round of a question and comments from panelists, we'll open it up to I guess you call it the floor, the audience, although the future that was the audience or something like this. So the next question is, what is the most powerful example of a research design, that can disrupt, or transform platform power? And we actually haven't discussed what platform is or platformization, so that's also another interesting keyword that's used in many different ways. So does anybody want to start with that?
Maybe I'll throw out a couple
Yes,
examples. I was thinking about what kind of platforms we're talking about, what is platform accountability, what kind of power we're talking about too. And one thing that popped in my head was like refusals as well. So Sidewalk Labs is something that was coming up for me. The Amazon headquarters in New York City, for instance. But what I think is super interesting about research design is when it's trying to help us think or see differently. And so even what Andrea was talking about in terms of the ethics conversation is super interesting to me. Research designs, of course, that make power visible and see how power is operating, what sustains it, how it circulates, how we are involved in it. Research designs that make accessible tools and strategies and that are fun and playful, experimental, and sometimes practical. I thought it was a great question, trying to figure out, what's a research design that could disrupt or transform platform power. Like, I guess that's what we should be oriented towards if that's our object of research. But a couple examples that came to mind that at least are fun and playful. One is from Benjamin Bratton's book, The Stack. And he mentions this example of the Del Monte corn of can. And it's by this Japanese artist, Nobutaka Aozaki, and the work is called Value Added, number 240950, Del Monte whole kernel corn, no salt added, 2012. But basically, it's a performance art, and the artist takes this can of corn, the exact same can of corn, it keeps going into supermarkets and gets it scanned and pays for it. And it does it in like 105 different supermarkets. And I just think it's so fascinating because it keeps working within these structures, within these systems. And it also, as Bratton talks about, it registers, so it means that there's going to be a supply and demand chain that's going to be affected. There's going to be an order maybe for another can of Del Monte corn to each of these supermarkets, right? And so to me, it's just fascinating. Bratton again talks about it in terms of an address. So it triggers this supply and demand chain. Once the laser at the checkout scans the code, it's unknown to other systems that it has already been addressed by other stores, and that it actually isn't even an address from that particular store. And so for me, using the logics and undermining the logics of the platforms and understanding their operation and making noise is super interesting as a strategy. And in terms of my interest in recasting the work of software in a way that helps us sense how it operates more clearly. And it encourages us to even want to understand how things function and what's connected to what and what those logics are, and then work to undermine or co-opt those structures for our own purposes. But one more example I'll throw out there is Track Me Not. Maybe folks know about this, by Helen Nissenbaum and Daniel C. Howe and Vincent Tubiana. So it runs on your browser, and it periodically issues randomized search queries, this is from their website, to popular search engines. So it hides what you are searching for, and it's particularly interesting in terms of state interest in folks searching for things that might indicate that they are radicalized in some way or another, and particularly, we can talk about grad students who are doing great research on white supremacy, for instance, or on terrorism, and how lots of folks who are marginalized and under increased surveillance by the state, and their search strings, being able to add more noise to those systems is super interesting to me. So I kept returning to, does it actually disrupt or transform platform power? But does it help us see it and try and think through it and try and figure out ways of using it? That's where I got to.
Great.
I liked what you said, Rena, about research designs or tools that help us to see something in a new way, because that kind of ties into the example that I was thinking about. I'm kind of interested in algorithm and platform audits, and there can be all kinds of ones: security audits, privacy audits, like what the privacy commissioner would like to do of Facebook's privacy practices that they said, no, you shall not do. But also, I'm interested in recommendation systems and algorithms, platform algorithms. The research and design, anyway, that I thought was a great example is this one, and you may have read it too, it's an article by Christian Sandvik. And he has this study where it's an app that's installed in Facebook, and it gives you a different new news feed that shows you everything your friends have posted alongside your Facebook news feed, and allows you to see that you're missing stuff, that the Facebook news feed is curated. And so it really makes that visible. And then he asks the participants in the study to respond and to say how that fact that certain things were missing affects them. And they say things like, well, oh gee, if I had known that my friend so-and-so was going through that at that time, I would have reached out to them and said something. Or how come I didn't hear from so-and-so? I've been wondering, and now I realize they may have never seen my posting. And so that kind of research design that's meant to, and then he follows how people change how they use Facebook as a result of the new knowledge that they have through the study. And I really kind of admired that design, because not only it's a tool, it kind of gives new knowledge to people about how Facebook works, and is also kind of oriented to transforming something. In that case, it's users' use of Facebook or how they use it and how they interact with it. But I think, there's other research as well that could be oriented towards regulatory change as well in a similar way. I should just point out, we should try to move the microphone for the recording a little bit. It doesn't have to be right in front of us, but.
Okay.
So that means somebody from the end of the table needs to speak.
A lot of actually what I want to discuss around research design, I think I'm going to save for the next question because there's an overlap. But I will say, I think, and I think I put this in the notes in the document, that I think part of sort of how we think about designing our research, we can also learn from civic and tech and community engagement initiatives. I think there's a lot going on there. And a lot of these projects aim to reveal platform power, broadly speaking. So just drop that in.
Okay. Christina, do you want to say anything?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the main things that, because I'm sort of biased as somebody who does a lot of historical methodologies, I'm very interested in sort of pulling out the sort of like historical infrastructures that sort of shape the platforms that we're in. So I'm really interested in, I'm certainly not a copyright expert, but I'm interested in the ways that, the earlier practices of licensing and copyright have continued to inform streaming platforms. I'm also really interested in, I guess one of the things that really deeply interests me is thinking about sort of livable futures for musicians. And so, I think one of the things that's really challenging about things like, Bandcamp, which are other, sort of other ways outside of that sort of, streaming ecosystem to change things, is that they get bought up by larger streaming services and, are sort of keep being folded into sort of, sort of is more established music industry and sort of, music tech industry sorts of things. I guess when I think about, through truly disruptive things, I'm always very struck by the sort of vogue that we have for the mixtape and the nostalgia and the ways that plays out and the ways that really, there is a sense of people sort of really claiming the sort of physical copies of music and ways of sort of moving it around, which of course can't be tracked in the same sorts of ways, or the sort of ways that people have embraced, vinyl records. Terrible for the environment, but, great for, like, diving in at record stores and garage sales, but also, being mindful of the ways that can, like, I think we also be very careful about sort of privileging sort of connoisseur discourses in music as well, and those often feed into those. And, I'm very interested in sort of also, sort of accessing and being wary of the ways that people who use easy music services are often denigrated in very gendered sorts of terms. And, I maintain a wariness about that.
So, that's great. Do you want to say anything, Tamara?
Yeah, sure. I guess talking about research design, there are a lot of cool things going on, like as you pointed out, Rena, too. These sort of exciting, playful, multimodal sorts of interventions going on. But I think for me, one of the things that's been the most helpful and influential are like classic kind of critical political economy research that's uncovering the really deep links between tech industry and government. So, for example, work on lobbying is really fascinating and hard to access because all of this stuff is very shrouded. But the idea of the revolving door, right? So people who are sort of executives in the tech industry who end up in government positions and vice versa, and how that sort of cross-pollination breeds this very lax regulatory environment that seems kind of insurmountable, is I think important for us to learn about, and then potentially to challenge through more traditional means of, just like through like voting and being involved in electoral politics and trying to change government representation to be a little bit more, I guess, tough on this industry that's run amok. So, for example, like I know, like with the upcoming U.S. election, this is a big point of conversation for certain candidates. Like Elizabeth Warren, for example, one of her platform issues is to break up Facebook, so to separate out WhatsApp and Instagram and no longer have it as this sort of behemoth. So I think there's also kind of more old school kinds of research that can inform this sort of disruptive orientation.
Can I add something? I don't know if we need to move the mic. So based on Christina, but what Tamara is saying, there is this thinking about historical infrastructures and also policy history. So one of the most exciting projects that I will dive into soon for myself is looking at what previous policy told us about issues of privacy. So for instance, thinking about the 1970 Department of Communication telecommission report that came out where they talked about a right to communicate, and they talked about a right to privacy, and they talked about things like wired cities, and looking at Globe and Mail coverage of how that policy initiatives were talked about in the 1970s, written in very eloquent manner in the media then at that time. Quite fascinating. So what can we learn from how old policy issues and concerns were talked about? And how does this reflect upon our current conversations about tech regulation? And why didn't things, if you talked about a right to communicate and a right to privacy, why did we get to the sense, I think it's called neoliberalism or something. Anyway, all those things didn't happen. So I think we do need to look back and see, and even, early mid-1990s stuff on information highway and IHAC and all of that sort of stuff, where my students sometimes roll their eyes because it's, they were what, born digital, born native. Can't remember what that expression is. So looking back, I think, is super important because we can learn a lot. And I'm sure, in your work on, historical look at copyright and whatnot, that really has impacted. The other thing would be sort of from a pedagogical perspective, teaching undergraduates and master's students in critical policy literacy. So issues of developing digital policy literacy. So how can we unpack a lot of the technologies that we're using in terms of political economy, in terms of policy processes, and in terms of infrastructures. And so taking that sort of framework, and Tamara and I have done some work on that, and I've continued to do work on that and sort of drill down with these sort of different frameworks to look at different ways of thinking about, let's say, how young people are using photo sharing apps and privacy issues there and things like that. So fun stuff. Anything else you want to add? Anybody else? No.
Do you think policymakers, when they see this kind of history, if you bring that out to them and show them, like, look, this is a cyclical thing, and this is what folks were talking about before in this space, does that make it more legible to them, or does that have that potential?
I think it's a great question. I think it depends on the policymaker and the context, and I don't want to name names, or departments or things like that. But I think there is, in many instances, in the feds now, an interest in what academics are doing in policy and how they're articulating policy issues. And even if you are coming from, a critical perspective, I think it behooves us as scholars, because we got to write and use a certain language for the certain journals that are peer reviewed, yada yada yada. What would be, if we're presenting that, what would be the deck that we would present that we might unpack some of the obfuscatory, I can't even say the word, obfuscatory language we often use, right? So I think it kind of goes both ways. So I do think, I'm kind of hopeful, but I also think, when Tamara's talking about the revolving door, that's super fascinating. Like, how do you track that and the sort of social networks of that happens? Yeah, that's really, 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 really interesting. But also a sort of question I have is, what are the structures of processes of participation in policymaking, and what's happening right now? There's a lot of initiatives, but how is meaningful public engagement actually happening on the ground? And I think if we probably could take couple different moments in the last 20 years and looking at different political, who's been in power. Was it, Harper? I think there was Martin. There was, Trudeau. Ooh, what's happening there? Is it really meaningful participation?
It's true what you're saying. Like, there are moments where the door kind of peeks open a little bit, where you can get in, and regulators seem to be, at least on the surface, really interested in what academics are doing. And there are these moments where you can get in there and they want to hear. But as we all know, you know, it's like another thing that you have to do that's not in your job description. So there's like, and there's pretty big barriers to entry, right?
Yep.
Like, because it's a whole other sort of jargon, this
Yep.
sort of like technocratic space
Yep.
of policymaking that you have to become initiated into in order to be legible by them. So there is a challenge, there's a hurdle there, but I think it's actually very, for me anyway, it's been super rewarding to be involved in some of those policy conversations, even if I feel like I'm coming out of left field, literally. In some of those spaces. But I think they want to hear more voices, and they hear the same voices all the time because the industry has the resources and has the lawyers, essentially, to be able to participate in open policy conversations more so than anyone else. So these stages where you have public input tend to be dominated by industry lawyers. And that's a problem, and it's a problem that we have to sort of, as you're saying, navigate what we have to do for our jobs as academics, so publishing in these peer-reviewed journals, and go sort of above and beyond that in some ways to translate our work for these other audiences. And it's crucial, I think, to be getting in there. And the more that we get in there, the more we can prise open that door for additional voices and amplifying the voices also of groups that really are disenfranchised in that process.
Yeah, and civil servants are human beings too, so, you know, I think there's often things that civil servants can't do or say because of organizational structures, and of course that could be the politics and the culture at particular moments, et cetera. So I think one has to also be kind of empathetic to the situation they're in. You know, you might ask them a question, they're like, well, is this going to be on the record? Oh, is this part of an academic paper you're publishing? Oh, you know, all of a sudden you get sent to the media relations person because they're going to handle it, right? Which, so it's also understanding. So no more questions here. Should we open up to the audience? Or do you have any, you're kind of all dark looking at here. Like there's some, anybody have any questions? Yes, and I do recognize that is Professor Doc Savage from.
The conversation you started, I think, is a really interesting one, and a number of us have done that kind of almost ethnographic research following around the public servants. My question is, are there really any public servants left making
interesting.
those decisions? Sort of, because I've been out of that for about 10 years, and I'm interested in whether there are those sort of, what's the word, dispassionate, you know, if you think of what's going on in this province, and the way in which policy seems to be announced, you wonder what, you know, generally, what public servants are doing in terms of policy making, because it seems to happen much more politically. But I'm wondering what you sort of feel, especially Tamara.
Oh, wow. I mean, I know individuals that are really keen to do policy in the public interest. Often, I mean, this started, you know, even 20 years ago, it would be that, well, we can't do these things, but you as an academic on a research project can tell this to us. And that can be the way that we can try to effectuate change. And if you think about all the Shirk partnership grants where, you know, you get community partners, government partners, and whatnot, that is a sort of way of, you know, trying to get things happening. I have stories to tell, but I'm not going to tell stories because I don't want to tell stories that I shouldn't tell, and, you know, because I'm being live streamed and et cetera. But I mean, I think there are good people that are working in these contexts. I totally understand where you're coming from. I also think that it is up for renewal if you think about the federal public service in the sense that they're really hungry for really smart, energetic, engaged young people. And I'm very pleased to note that some of our recent graduates from U of T, I kind of know where they're going, and it's cool. It's like really cool because I know that they have the right ethos of what they're doing. But yeah, I don't, you know.
It's very, depends on who's there at the time, right? So it's, there are a lot of individual factors that come into play. And my experience has mostly been at the CRTC, so Canada's federal telecoms and broadcasting regulator. And, you know, it really depends who the chair is. And the chair sets the tone for what sorts of initiatives they're going to do and what sorts of sort of timelines they have. So, for example, there was this suggestion of having this Internet Code of Conduct, right? So similar to the wireless code, the idea was brought forth to create an Internet code that would be protecting consumers. So really, consumer rights is the main framework right now at the CRTC through which you can kind of get any of these ideas heard. So that's, of course, a limited framework in certain ways, but it does allow for these conversations to happen to some degree. So anyway, they had this idea to propose an Internet Code of Conduct, but they made the deadline something like 30 days. And if you're an academic, you know, like 30 days is not enough time to do any sort of meaningful research and package it up for them. So, so a bunch of people wrote a sort of letter to try to indicate this, to say, you know, actually, if we had more time, we could present you with something really meaningful. And particularly because the CRTC hadn't released its own report, the Communications Monitoring Report that they release every year that gives you the sort of state of affairs in Canada. So there are ways you can try to push back and as Leslie was saying, sort of form a kind of coalition of other people who are like-minded and who want to have those conversations with the regulator and can't. And so you can put some pressure on them that way. But a lot of it just depends on like the current regime, right? So it's hard to know. Although at the CRTC, it seems as though they are genuinely interested in what academics have to say, and they've created positions where they have an in-house scholar. So last year, Catherine Middleton from Ryerson spent a year at the CRTC, basically working with them, sitting in on meetings, you know, chiming in on certain things that they were doing to try to suggest ways that they could be more open to broader public participation. And I think that's a really genuine effort on their part to try to open up. I think they are interested in opening up for many reasons. I think not all, of course, participation is never perfect. And of course that they have their legitimacy is at stake as a public regulator, so they need to at least appear to be open to the public. So, you know, cynically, there are these other motivations potentially at play. But nonetheless, they are doing those things, and there are opportunities that can be seized, I think, still.
Yeah, I went there a year ago with a research team to present research in progress and, you know, small round table of participants. It was great. So I do think I'm trying to, I think, thinking optimistically as well. Any other comments about that or from anybody in the audience? Yes, and could you introduce yourself too?
Yes, I'm Luis. I'm a student here at McMaster. And so, well, this is a question that is related to question number 2 from the projector, and it's related to what you were, like the summary you were saying, you were doing in terms of what terms were you using and here in the panel, and what terms, like as opposed to the terms that usually developers use. And so I wrote the question because it's a little bit intricate.
Okay.
So bear with me. Okay, so in her book, in one decision book called Program Visions, she mentions that the terminal of a computer is the embodiment of the women, the first women programmers in the military. And so she says this because these terms, how the user now provides commands to the terminal. And so it's like that. So she mentions that at the beginning, like the military were giving commands to these women, you know, in very strict ways, and then these women were responding to those comments in very efficient ways. And so my question is for you that if, in this sense, do you think that the expectations of apps and software to be beautiful, responsive, and friendly is also part of this patriarchal culture and this embodiment that Wendy Chun is telling us about? Or do you think this is just good research design practices?
That's a great question, and I know Rena's dying to say something. I'm going to say one thing just before. It's sort of thinking about the historical origins of technology and going back, you know, the sort of the gender history of computers and whatnot. That's we can't lose sight of that. And there's been some great research, Marie Hicks writing about that, Gen Light, and so on and so forth. But yeah, you're like, go girl.
Yeah, I know that book very well and enjoy a lot of things from it. And yeah, for me, what's really interesting there in that piece about thinking about the terminal, and also how women's role there then got embedded inside the machine, right? And so then they disappeared. And so yeah, it's really important to draw out that history of who was involved and how they were involved, and what those specific processes are about how computers used to work and how they work today, and even what we know and what we don't know, and about those processes, and what we can see and understand and not understand. And so yeah, for seeing these like glossy user interfaces, trying to make them super appealing, Megan Ankerson is another person to look at in terms of, she's got a book coming out soon, and looking at some of these interfaces and even the whiteness of design practices. But yeah, it could be a reflection of that for sure. It could also be working to, distract and be super shiny, to draw people into, like how we were hearing in terms of the music industry and the streaming services, but to distract us from the ways in which things function underneath. And so a major piece from Chen's book there, Program Visions, is about how computing and software is this metaphor for so many things, right? And so how it's like a metaphor of a metaphor, but not to get too deep into that, but how we think that computers can do like almost everything and anything, but we don't really understand how they function, and that there's lots of slips and gaps and glitches and things like that involved. And so maybe that's another way to think about it, is to look at that interface and to take it apart to see the other layers. And even if it's bright and shiny, it's still doing all sorts of things to us.
Anybody else?
Well, I would say briefly, I think even to attend to that question is also larger histories of communication technologies. You can go all the way back to the railroad and think about the ways in which marginalized and racialized bodies help basically sustain even data centers and where we are now. So it's a really, really important question.
And I would just add that I think it also layers onto discourses of care work, and the ways that that is carried out in very racialized and gendered sorts of ways, but that care work is also really essential for survival. And I think that's the thing I keep coming back to. It's not just that it's caring for us in particular ways, but we're having to use these things to survive in the particular sort of neoliberal space in which we find ourselves. And so, yeah, I feel like there's always a push and pull between, it's not just exploiting the machine or drawing on these problematic histories. Those are also doing, real work that is necessary for human survival.
Okay, yes.
Matt Stahl, Western. It seems like one of the sort of most sinister things that I've been hearing about anyways, is predictiveness. That apps making prediction more and more efficient and individualized. And I'm wondering if in any of your research you've come across propositions or speculation about the potentially liberatory use of prediction. How are predictive tools are they just one-way tools, or do they offer any promise?
So the liberatory potentials of predictive technologies, predictiveness.
You've studied, or anything you've encountered, focused on, those tools don't seem to be going away anytime soon.
Yeah.
Antoinette Rouvroy and Thomas Burns have a really interesting analysis of algorithmic governmentality, where they talk about how algorithms are liberatory from one point of view, in the sense that they kind of embed liberal values and that are freeing in some ways, and that do give the appearance or actually move away from government policy or regulation in the traditional sense. They don't argue that overall it's. They argue that it's that algorithmic governance is liberatory but not emancipatory, is their kind of conclusion. So it's kind of a neat article. It's called something like Algorithmic Governance and the Promise of Emancipation or something like that.
And by whom? Can you tell us again, Sarah?
Antoinette Rouveroy and Thomas Burns.
Okay.
I think, you know, what sort of even within popular discourse, what we see is that, you know, algorithms or AI are inherently liberatory, but there's like a cruel optimism to that liberation because it's we're always like perpetually moving towards it, but never actually, you know, getting there. So it's this interpass that we sort of find ourselves in.
And yeah, when I think about predictiveness, like the first thing that pops in my head is the predictive policing stuff. And I know I have colleagues who've been trying to say, well, is there any value in there at all? And I haven't seen anything yet. But when I think of predictiveness, I also think about that speculative design. And so thinking about taking some of those vectors from today and pushing them into the future. So what if it's perfect prediction? Like, what does that look like? And what kind of world is that then? And we can speculate from there. But in terms of the identity space where I work, I think there's always the issue of being able to be identified and to be able to identify and be able to collect data and of a group for specific purposes, to ask for resources and to make shift and to make change, but at the same time to be identified, you know, has all those things that come along with it, with surveillance and everything else. And so like I think about Sasha Costanza-Chalk's work and looking at moving through airports and like even that could be a form of predictiveness of, you know, what gender is this body, and but how many times it messes up. I'm also thinking about Joy. I forget her last name.
Joy. Yeah, but
Starts with a B. Thank you. Thank you. Looking at artificial intelligence and how there, like, really clearly shows that that as soon as you take an intersectional lens to this issue, you see that, like when blackness, for instance, enters the frame, gender is less able to be identified, or people in general are less able to be identified. And so it really works well for like white guys, some of this. And so it's interesting also to think through, well, what does that mean in terms of perfecting these systems and moving more towards perfect prediction, if that's a thing.
I think, yeah, like what you're saying, Rena, and in a lot of my understanding of prediction, it's like, well, prediction is in some ways an inherently conservative activity because you're basing, you know, you're trying to predict something based on past behaviors. And so in that sense, it's inherently conservative, and also that the predominant designers of these systems are already enmeshed in this like commercial space that is very invested in risk management and comes a lot from like the insurance industry, for example. So if you're in this sort of risk averse, conservative kind of like value assemblage, you're going to have these systems that are going to be inherently not liberatory or emancipatory or whatever, because they come from those values. And like you're saying, it's the sort of white guy problem of tech, right? Which is that people are designing systems for themselves, essentially. So my understanding of prediction is that there's not a lot of wiggle room outside of maybe some of these more experimental initiatives. But I think the other thing is, if you take it to like thinking more about artificial intelligence and trying to think about like algorithmic governance or what algorithms are doing as sort of human on some levels, then that might open up some space. And I know that there are some regulatory proposals for like, how do we think of AI under sort of personhood, the construct of personhood. As AI systems become more and more sophisticated and more able to embrace like anomalous results, then do they start to take on a new status? Should we be thinking of them not as technologies devoid of sort of like sociality, or should we be thinking of them as semi-human or post-human, or whatever word you want to use? So I think that there might be some sort of potential. I mean, you can go back to like this sort of cyborg manifesto idea and have this maybe some hope for what could come. But I think right now, like, the majority of these technologies are just so entrenched in this commercial system that there's not a lot of hope in that space.
Can I just mention Jason Lewis on that line from Concordia, who's looking at artificial intelligence as kin, and so taking an indigenous lens to this issue, and has a piece out that's with a few other co-authors that's really fascinating.
Can I also add one thing? I think in the realm of cultural production, one of the things that is interesting to me is that predictiveness is also tied to pleasure. Part of the thing is, can Netflix actually recommend things that you like? Is that, I think that is, in part of the fun of Spotify is a list that they give you on Monday, that it's going to give you things that you're going to like. And I think one of the things that, I recognize that it addresses sort of like knowledge gaps, or it addresses the sorts of, like the limited time we have to curate for ourselves. I think as it's often framed in like the language of curation. But I'm also, struck by the way that it also kind of takes us away from being presented with things that we don't like. That, sometimes that things that we don't like, or that are different, or that are challenging, I think are actually really good for us. And in many ways that commercial space means that we're sort of cushioned from being, hit with things that might sort of challenge our aesthetics or our experience about how the world should look.
You're talking about children and or students or something. So there's a question there, Tom. Yes, Tom.
Tom Streeter from Western, and this is all fantastic. And I just actually have a kind of case. I wonder if you all might reflect on. Mostly because it's a puzzle to me, which is Netflix, which is a blacker box than Facebook and Google in terms of what it's actually up to. And the argument's been recently remade in op-eds and stuff, but it's been there for a while, which is they have to be gathering data and have a way to monetize that. They say they're of course gathering data, but they say they're just making money from subscriptions, and yet they're desperately trying to figure out ways to make sure that people will always click on the next show within 10 seconds, and you can watch them doing that. And so I wonder if you could talk about what to do about, on a regulatory level, about Netflix's black boxness and the likelihood that they are using artificial intelligence to gather excruciatingly detailed information about people for purposes they're not telling anyone yet. So,
Cue in the scary music right now. Who do you want to take that one? Sarah?
Well, and I love that term that you used there. Well, just to change it a bit, the blackest of black boxes about Netflix. I've never heard that before. And of course, and we know that Netflix has been asked to share data with the CRTC and had a real battle with the CRTC over that, which is such an important battle because it's just a toe in the pool in terms of a lever to regulate. It's the first step is just give us data, and they know that, and that's partly, I'm sure, why they didn't want to do it, along with the fact of wanting to keep the data secret. That's so interesting. When you look at the Netflix annual reports, there's nothing there about selling the data, or but is it is something happening that's being hidden, or there backroom agreements with other platforms that there's data trading going on? Who knows? I'm not saying there is. I just that's a fascinating proposition.
And sometimes
it's like you can't explain their revenues, at least over the long term, purely in terms of subscription fees.
Well, you think it doesn't add up. Really?
And I was just going to say, sometimes it's about amassing as many users, like dominating in a market, and then having plans and ideas, and maybe later, whatever's going to happen. But it's super interesting. And I was listening to someone talk about how things are happening in terms of creating TV and movies in Europe, and how Netflix is, has its fingers all over the world, but also how it's incredible that to be able to get distribution, to be able to have, like, there's growing distribution in terms of European-made content in Netflix and in, like, those sorts of platforms right now, where they couldn't get access to North America at all. And so now it's like, oh, this is exciting. Like, we could have distribution here. This is so possible and easy. And so to be able to amass content as well, to be able to amass, like, this users, I don't know, but I don't know where they're headed.
And it also raises issues of, in Canada, a Netflix tax, do we do that? Quebec versus Canada, issues of, Canadian and Quebec sovereignty in terms of the cultural industry. So that's also, it's been played out there, but I smell a research project, Tom. That's what I smell. Any, yes?
Yeah, sorry, I'm Jessica from McMaster. I just wanted to ask you, because I've been just wondering, because all the people that are here, we belong to a certain kind of generation that we still care about these things, and we think they're scary.
Yeah.
But what do you think about, like, younger generations? I think they had just give up their freedom and their autonomy because of the good things that these algorithmic systems can bring them. Like, I'm telling this because I teach a TA class that we cannot touch of some of these things, and when I talk to my students, I say, like, maybe you will get in, like, certain kind of things because of your activity, and they don't care. They say, like, yeah, we know that, but it's okay. So what do you think about, like, this younger generation that they just have, I think it's not that they don't care, it's that they just have to give up.
So when you say younger generation, can you be more precise? Are you thinking about undergraduates or high schoolers?
It's undergrad students, yeah. And also I was in Mexico, I was teaching to high school, and it was kind of like the same reaction to this kind of thing that I was telling them. So
I usually bring my students over to the dark side really quickly, so.
I've noticed, though, a difference. Me too. Yeah, I always try to get them to quit whatever social media sites they're using. It's not always successful, though. But yeah, I've noticed a big difference in the past few years of teaching, where the sort of celebratory rhetoric around social media is almost gone now. They come into the first year class already understanding that there are these problems because of huge breaches like Cambridge Analytica or whatever. So I think the tone has really changed. It's less work now to convince students that social media have, like, bad sides or whatever, in my experience at least. But there is, I think what's going on more is, like, a shift in which platforms are being used. So, like, kids don't use Facebook or Twitter or whatever.
They use Instagram, but then you say, who owns Instagram? And they're like, it's Facebook. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think they see themselves as sort of, like, escaping a lot of these problems because they're not necessarily using those platforms that we talk about a lot in academia. And I think a lot of the disconnect is, especially around Twitter, because Twitter is the one that was more open to academics. So if you take a look on, like, Google Scholar or something, disproportionately the research is about Twitter, even though Twitter is potentially not the most important of these big platforms, right? So I think that's interesting. But yeah, I think there is a thing where, as you say, it's not that they don't care. Like, the young people that we've had, conversations with in our research with Leslie, they don't not care about it, but I think there's a certain understanding of the trade-off, right?
Yeah.
So it's just that they in some ways have grown up with this trade-off and understand, like, there is a trade-off there, and you're going to have to give up something to get certain services or whatever. Whereas maybe people who haven't had it so seamlessly in their lives in certain ways feel the trade-off more. It's like almost an affective relationship to the technology, where you are so accustomed to having your cell phone on you all the time, and it's this very intimate sort of device that you don't necessarily feel as though you're giving up something necessarily. So I don't know, that's been my experience with research with younger people.
Well, and it's also the reason why regulation is so important, because, you know, we've created a world where it's so difficult to get off of social media or to protect your own privacy, impossible in fact, and it has real consequences for people in terms of who they can keep in touch with and not in touch with, and the work that they can do, that the choices are not there actually, and because there hasn't been strong enough privacy regulation to make sure that viable choices are in front of people, that could be if platforms and regulators operated differently.
Yeah, your point about choice is so important because, like, one thing that fascinates me is what's going on in China. So if you look at like super apps like WeChat, for example, if you're in China and you're using WeChat, you use it throughout your day for everything. For like it combines like Uber and Venmo and Maps and whatever, and you're at a restaurant and you do your order on WeChat and your food gets brought out by like a little, like, you know, water thing. And then you pay using the app, and you arrange your whole life using this app, and you never really leave this app. And then the way that it works there is like the tech industry is so enmeshed with government that obviously all of this stuff goes toward government surveillance, and then can furnish practices like the social credit system, where then, you know, you can or cannot fly out of the country based on what sorts of credit you've amassed or whatever. And so I think this point about this sort of autonomy that you have as a user of these things is totally spot on, Sara, because it's like you can see why young people then would be kind of resigned to, like, well, I have to use these systems. There's no way out in some ways. And if you look at China as the example of like what potentially the big apps in North America are going to become, then you know, you just get further and further enmeshed in those systems.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and research my colleagues and I have done looking at young kids and privacy, it's often, you know, there's a distinction between social and informational privacy. So social privacy, how I'm communicating with my peers, and there's sort of a sort of almost code of conduct of what you would put online, what you would share or not share, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and how you would curate your identity according to different platforms. And then the sort of black box of informational privacy and the corporatization of and the ownership of these platforms, and issues of fair information practices, where, you know, it's not like they're taught this in a civics class in high school or things like this, but that I see more of a resignation in terms of what the platform can do, or the corporation. Well, I've clicked this privacy policy, that means they're clearly protecting my privacy. So that's the sort of issue of digital media literacy that really has to start, you know, at really early stages and things like that.
So, I mean, and I'm interested in not just the privacy issue, but one of my big jobs in my music industry class is getting my students to think about how they're actually supporting musicians and livelihood. And one of the big shifts that I've seen in, you know, the past 3 or 4 years has been, it's gone from students, of course, just downloading music and, you know, thinking about buying a band CD or merch as a kind of like almost like a charity for, you know, to support a band that you like, that's what you do, to feeling like because they're paying a subscription to Spotify or to Apple Music, that they're paying for their music. Like, what more could you possibly want? And so then we have a lot of discussion about how much money, you know, your local musicians or your, you know, middle-class musicians, as Cobalt Music Group calls it, are actually getting from the sort of streaming services. And, you know, really questioning like how we're actually paying creative workers, especially in fields like music, which is, you know, obviously operates at a sort of much smaller portion of the economy than, say, you know, television and film.
Yes.
Hi, I might be jumping ahead here, but I think Tamara, you kind of hinted at this, and I wanted to get back to the question that you said that you were going to answer next. And I'm actually really curious about what you all think about the relationship between question number 5, and question about regulation, and questions about research design, and how we regulate internet research. How are we thinking about REBs? How are we thinking about the ways that researchers are piggybacking on the kinds of algorithms and other platform affordances in the context of the research? How are people, you know, scraping data in order to find out potentially fucked up things about minoritized populations? Are they publishing those things? And so I'm just curious about research design, maybe coming back to what you hinted at, Tamara, and I'm wondering, are ethics the same as regulation? And kind of thinking about that.
Could I ask who you are?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm T.L. Cowan from Toronto.
Okay.
You guys.
Okay. I mean, that does segue into, there is a blending of our questions, so this is good.
Sorry, Andrea, I had
It's okay.
Andrea.
You were looking my way, so I was just gonna like, I'm answering this. Sorry.
We've known each other for a long time.
And we know each other too well, but no, it's okay.
They're fans.
Yeah, no, that's a great segue actually. So you know, as I said before, like what I've been thinking about. So I've been thinking about this idea of ethical infrastructure, and it's not quite a research design, but I'm wondering if it could develop into a research design or as a possible framework for evaluating platform politics. And so I came to it through similar questions around research ethics and the challenges that researchers are consistently encountering. So this idea, or the term originates from legal discourse. So I'm less interested in, you know, assessing sort of moral values or behaviors. And I'm more interested in how it might be used as a framework to assess how social values like fairness, equity, and inclusivity are sustained throughout a platform's life cycle. So that's where like the infrastructure element comes into play. So how do these kinds of values how register across various resources and objects that are arranged to produce these platforms? Things like, you know, the kinds of social values that are reflected and reproduced by artifacts, techniques, organization systems, all these, you know, that constitute the platform. So I've started working through this idea, and what drew me into it was when Google put forward their Advanced Technology External Advisory Council, which is, anyway, that's how I got to this. And so most of you probably know, but it was established to help implement the company's AI principles, and what Google described as, I have here, an ethical charter to guide the responsible development and use of AI in our research and products, which is, you know, noble and fine. And so, you know, I think there's 7 principles, and it's things like avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias, or incorporate privacy design principles. And these things really fall short of, you know, this list. It's more like a mantra of sorts, and it really falls short of applied ethics. And, you know, so questions arise around, you know, how will these principles be integrated into Google's organizational or professional culture? What about oversight or consequences when these principles are breached? What about independent enforcement mechanisms? And what we start to see, right, if we think about it, then maybe what's also happening, again, to go back to a point earlier, is this ethics washing or ethics theater. So these principles and the formation of the council insinuate that Google really cares about ethics, but in practice little or nothing is being done to implement ethics in an applied sense. And it's complicated further when we consider the membership of the council. So amongst those asked was a CEO of a drone company and the president of a right-wing think tank who has a history of anti-immigrant and transphobic advocacy. Right. So luckily, when Google went public with their council, there was such an uproar both within the company and in the public at large that they pulled back and you know, dismantled this thing. But we're pressed to ask, you know, around these questions, like what expertise and worldviews does Google value to help steer an ethical charter? How do these competencies and experiences reflect social values? Whose values? What are ethics in these contexts? And so, you know, there's been a lot of talk about this buzzword of ethics and how it's being used to enable platforms to reshape even our understanding of ethics in their image. And I think that's really important in research contexts, because in many ways what we're already seeing is with the kind of dearth of guidance around, let's say, even social media research, sometimes people will default to terms of use or terms of service, which are not research ethics, right? It governs like how one is able to interact with a platform. And so here we see this relationship of a platform as gatekeeper. So all of that to say, I think there's the possibility that we might start to re-articulate and pull away sort of these conversations of ethics that big tech or enterprise are having, and start thinking about it in the arena of regulation, which is not my wheelhouse, but certainly like making these connections that it's not just a problem that's happening within the university. You know, that at any time you want to do research with or through a platform as a source of evidence, as an object of study, you're always implicated with that entity, right? So there's a complicity, I think, that needs to be acknowledged. But I think that's a really fantastic question.
Yeah, and I also, just to follow up, I really like what you said earlier too about learning from other models like community engagement, like thinking about using community engagement research models for research on social media.
Yeah, like DocNow is a really good example because it helps mediate the intricacies around using Twitter as a data source. And sort of helps to orient and navigate researchers through the process of, you know, so you're scraping this data, and now what do you do? And how do you ensure that you are constantly in conversation with your participants when you're not actually in conversation with those individuals that you should feel some responsibility towards?
Yeah, what is that?
DocNow, it's called? Yeah.
Thank you.
I would be curious to know more about what responses research ethics boards at universities have had after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. I don't know if you've followed that at all, or if there has been. I haven't heard a lot about it. And I think I love your term ethics theater, because I do wonder how much ethics theater goes on in universities, and how much of that sort of data is around, and what universities are doing about it. Not just universities, but also political parties, completely outside of privacy law, except in BC, with huge databases of stuff. And I think there's ethics there as well, but universities.
I just want to say, I think that our REBs are sort of overtaxed with a lot of these research questions. And we're seeing, especially in Canada, this trend towards research data management. Which is like really important, right, in terms of the life cycle of your data and how you're securing it and carrying it through and able to reproduce it. And as Tri-Council sort of hands down these or dictates, you know, that we need to move towards open data, it's vital to the longevity of a research project. But it's not the same as research ethics, right? Like data management, it's not interchangeable, and in fact, you know, the sort of ethical considerations need to, we need to encounter these questions even before we get to the management part. So maybe that is sort of a response. It was happening before the Cambridge Analytica scandal blew up, but there is this appeal towards risk management in that respect. And so will it inform ethics? Probably not, but it will help us feel more secure that we're doing the right thing with our data.
And I think we're also, sorry, just to butt in, you know, in terms of research ethics at universities governed by Tri-Council policies and TCPS, et cetera. And, you know, often it's difficult for them to keep up with the sort of current trends, let's say in doing, you know, writ large internet research, and different institutions, you know, handle that differently, but they do tend to be, in my experience, a bit risk averse in terms of you know, trying to protect the human data subjects that you're working with, but also it can, you know, be a long, arduous process to get these things approved. At least in my experience. There was a Rena. And then there's a comment from the back, this gentleman.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I've been thinking and writing about this too, and how like it's frustrating. I hear a lot of people, students and faculty saying, you know, oh, I don't want to go through ethics, or it's going to be difficult, or it's going to be tough, and thinking that that is the authority when we know that they don't necessarily understand all of these things. So I've been playing with the concept of youth, and like that REBs are youth, researchers are youthful, like in all these ways, and we're all trying to learn about this. But I've had experiences also where I've had to push back on what the research ethics board saying, and I want more stringent ethics than what they. So it's but it came over time of trying to figure out, well, how does this relationship change?
Yeah.
They're not just this authority, but you know, you can have conversations, you can teach them.
And it's who is they within a research ethics board at a particular university. You know, if it's a full delegated board or others that are, you know, this is your service load for the year or something like that. So it's quite different. Gentleman in the back, I believe? Yes.
It wasn't a comment, but accept the question.
And who are you?
Alex, soon to be from McMaster.
Excellent. Good to meet you.
Yeah, well, so it's a question for Christina, I guess, and anybody else. But in terms of Spotify and how little the artists are benefiting from the streams that they receive, is it in the platform's best interest to sort of provide new features to the artists to allow to engage with their fans, to sort of monetize in other ways, or is that more solely up to the artists to find ways like leverage that popularity and reach out to their fans in other ways?
So you're asking if it's in Spotify's interest to try to, support sort of non-superstar artists and engaging fans on the Spotify platform as opposed to other platforms. Well, I was sort of, visiting around on the Spotify platform, and they do have different suggestions for, artists to use the platform effectively. I do get the sense that they do want artists uploading their work, and they have suggestions for how you can get yourself onto playlists and the strategies that are involved in doing that. I think the other piece, though, is that artists are being asked to do so much work in sort of, the promotions labor has been so downloaded to artists. Like we know that, like what it looks like to be signed to a label always, basically AR, A&R has been downloaded almost entirely onto artists themselves. The idea is that you have to demonstrate that you have, an ability to turn out a certain number of people coming to your shows. You have to demonstrate that you have a certain number of sort of like your engagement in social media is a really important piece. And only at that point is a label sort of willing to represent you and start taking on some of the sort of management load that you might be involved in. Is it in Spotify's interest to do that? I mean, I guess, Spotify's interest is in keeping its fees per stream low. Its interest is in, getting as many subscribers as possible. It's in selling as many ads as possible. It's finding excellent markets for the data that it's getting from its users. And I would imagine also from, those small independent artists that are uploading, they're also a very useful source of data. So, I mean, my sense is that, like so many of these platforms are driven by the amount of engagement that you have on a site. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I would speculate and say that, yes, it would be in Spotify's interest to pull in more of that engagement, because that might be pulling that away from artists' work on other sorts of platforms. I think there's also the sort of discourse of like disruptive groups. I mentioned Cobalt, which is kind of, billing itself as a middle-class musicians label that kind of is offering the services to help musicians interface with streaming services without the sort of, difficult entry level that you get into, signing with a major label or even with a smaller label. So, yeah, I don't know that it's, if we're thinking about Spotify's interest, I don't know that they're really taking on, I guess that sort of engagement is about, like the sort of, are they taking on some of the A&R role? And I see that in sort of a minor way, but I'm sure it's mostly geared towards, cornering as much as the market as they possibly can, which seems to be the strategy in the streaming platforms. Whoever has the sort of, largest user base is the one that is going to, go forward and thrive in the competition for, investors and subscribers. Yeah.
Okay, so in the interest of time, we've got 15 minutes. And so what I thought we'd do is sort of collapse the last three questions, because we've sort of certainly touched upon question number 3, what types of research on platforms and algorithms would you like to see more of? What barriers do we face in conducting research on platforms and algorithms? And this, we had a Google Doc planning document, ironically Google Docs. But anyway, a sort of question on regulatory futures should researchers attend to. And so what I thought I would do is just open it up to the panelists and see if anybody wants to say anything that hasn't been touched upon, because there has been some certainly blending of the questions in a really exciting way, actually.
Well, why don't I start? And I'm interested in the fifth question,
Okay.
so I'm going to jump to that question.
Excellent.
And it's been raised already. It's been touched on today. The question may have been you, Tamara, who mentioned it, of the relationship between platforms and government. And so the question is, what regulatory futures should researchers attend to? And I guess my answer is we should attend to or try to imagine a future where that relationship between platforms and politicians or political parties or government is less problematic. And the problem has been pointed to already, the revolving door that can happen between government, parties, and tech companies. The fact that parties directly use platforms, advertising political services, the political services unit in their political campaigns, and in some cases even platform employees are embedded in political parties' campaigns. This creates a huge problem when it comes time for government, where the party is now in power, to regulate platforms. That cozy relationship. And there's a similar relationship, but different, between media and politicians and media and government. One big difference is that there's, in the case of broadcasting, an arm's length regulator. And the whole history of Canadian broadcasting policy really circulates around the establishment of the distance between government and regulation, or government and the CBC. And the other difference is really stark when you're sitting there watching on Parleview the ethics committee, interrogating Facebook. And the first thing every politician says is, well, I use Facebook every day to communicate with my constituents. And you can just see, like, it's a personal relationship that every individual politician has. So I think that's something that scholars and communication scholars could really attend to, is that relationship that communication scholars have already examined quite extensively between media and politics, to now look at that when it comes to platforms.
Yeah, I'll just jump on. I agree with you, Sara. I also think, and particularly this is more the case in the US, follow the money. But the sort of huge, powerful influence of lobbying, money and power and influence, that is just absolutely phenomenal. And that it's really difficult to wrest away. So how much money are these, big tech companies putting into, K Street lobbying and whatnot? In Canada, we don't, this lobbying does happen, but it's not as obvious on the surface. But it does happen. And so it's cozy bedfellows indeed. And so I think that is very important to try to parse out.
Yeah, and all of these problems, as you both suggest, are obviously really poignant in liberal democracies. But then if you look at other kinds of regimes, there are other sorts of problems layered on top of these as well. So this sort of complicity with certain kinds of governments. So the way that Facebook, for example, if we're using Facebook, how its content moderation policies work in other sorts of regimes. So the way that certain kinds of content get taken down or not is important. Or like this Chinese example that I've given, basically that the platforms that are native to the Chinese internet ecosystem are hand in hand with the government surveillance program. So, this is really interesting. And I think research design that speaks to this is more sort of comparative work on what's going on not only in North America, but in other places in the world, because I think that there are other issues that come into stark relief once you look at other sorts of governments.
We're just going down past
I guess I just draw out the whiteness stuff again, especially like when you were mentioning the things we like and how we're kind of cushioned from certain things. So how is
how are our lives structured by the social infrastructure? And for me, like, software is obviously that big part of it. But how does, the invisibility of whiteness, the ways in which whiteness draws on a system of privilege to sustain and confirm power, how does that contribute to or operate in conjunction with the calculated invisibility of software processes? Like, how are these, like, lining up with one another? And so I was thinking about, like, Robin DiAngelo talks about white racial insulation, and so how there's a capacity for white folks to not think about race and to organize life in segregated ways, to not have to learn about race in complex ways, and especially the one that I'm really interested in is about a lack of tolerance for race-based stress. And so the reactions to that, right, is anger, victimhood, defensiveness, dominance, avoiding whiteness or white cultural identification altogether, and a disavowal of learning from and seeing that there's value from learning about and from and with people of color. So I'm wondering, like, these white cultural practices and their linkage to colonial logics and how those are actually embedded in these platforms, embedded in how life is being structured and shaped in these similar ways. Yeah, like, whiteness is central to the social construction of the default and of the norm. And so how I'm interested in studying software and platforms, it's about defaults and norms and dominant values and monopolies too. And so I see a lot of parallels there.
Well, I'm reflecting on what you're saying, as well as the comments about regulation and liberal democracies. And I think, going back to the sort of, underlying structures of radio and music, and the ways that, regulators have always defined the public interest in very problematic ways, in terms of often very high culture ways, or diversity in very troubling sorts of ways. Not necessarily in terms of representing different voices quite literally, but in terms of thinking about, ownership or, size of playlists or things like that. And of course, then the sort of, the persistent problem appeal that even precedes the broadcasting era about the ways that sort of, money finds its way in to sort of promote particular artists and sort of industry voices. And so when I'm thinking about that in terms of regulating platforms, I don't necessarily see, traditional regulation is a nice start, but I'm also reflecting on, Michelle Hilm's, call for remembering community media and those kinds of engagements and the kind of ways that those sort of difficult conversations and, thinking about different kinds of ways that participation and inclusive, genuine inclusiveness actually look. And so that's, that's where maybe, the gesture towards, if more regulation could look like that for finding sort of online platforms, then could look more like a community radio station.
That's interesting. I guess, for me, it goes to this urgency to find ways of intervening before there's a redefinition of ethics in the pressure to regulate. Right. So what is that going to mean? And even the term regulatory or regulation, I think that also needs to be unpacked. Like, are we talking about government regulation? Are we talking about self-regulation, which is, that would be an entirely sort of different problematic. So maybe thinking back to what TL, that question you asked, I guess that there is something about connecting these dots in the questions with research design and regulation that is worthwhile to pursue, to have these interventions, especially, like, as Tamara was talking about, with your experiences in some of these spaces, I guess in regulatory spaces, who gets to intervene, how do we intervene in much broader and diverse ways. So.
I don't really have anything to say. I did pick up another keyword that I think is super important, which is inclusiveness. There is a sort of also equity, diversity, inclusion, EDI as sort of that sort of governing a lot of ways universities are and peer review and research boards in Canada are operating under. Whether that actually happens, I'm not sure. Could be a Band-Aid thing. Does anybody else have anything to say? Is there a burning comment from the audience? Yes.
I was thinking, I'd like to go into some of the stuff that I was wondering about, this kind of question 5 that I want to talk on. So I think I have a bit of a policy question, maybe a bit of a speculative design kind of question, but I'm just curious when it comes to maybe ideas of power, but this ethical question that, like where we got to at the end there, but I find there's this larger, as we were talking about with the youth, and I think some of the senses and ideas, and I also TA the same course as Jessica there, and those issues come up with youth, etc., maybe being complicit in aspects of the platforms, and then I wonder though that when it comes to ethics, if they think, oh, well, outside of Cambridge Analytica scandal, they'll be like, it's, I think, a hard argument to say a company's being unethical, you know, to say, oh, well, you use our platform, we use your data to help you get ads.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and so I see those difficulties. Yeah. So then, I'm just wondering, assuming, as was mentioned in the beginning, let's say we continue on a trend of, you could say, neoliberal kind of global economics, maybe more conservative government comes into power in the next few years, whatever. There's this trend, let's even say austerity, etc. And I'm just wondering if, maybe this is the speculative design element, as far as regulation and policy, would you maybe, or what would maybe your ideas be around, for instance, grade school or high school educations to say, oh, for schools that are predominantly children of color, you should have classes on search engine optimization for yourself. You should have, I guess, media literacy, but have almost like dive into these ways, like this is how you create AdSense. This is the way you use profile and data skimming to promote your like local band or community center projects you're doing. But really kind of dive into kind of maybe not co-opting, but really embracing the tools that are being used. And well, because I'm also thinking about this one project, I forget the name, where they're saying they're using Google AdSense algorithms, I guess, and profiles to target people who are showing like profile trends that they might get radicalized and are going on like 8chan to look at radical right or even radical Islam like groups. So they actually show them ads to say, oh, come to our support group to kind of have somebody to talk to, and that might be that last point before they dive into 8chan and get violent soon. So using these tools, and then once again to go back to youth of color, to say, oh, well, this is, so maybe with Sophia Mojanoble, maybe like, in order to avoid racial co-optation, you can create search engine optimized profiles that can subvert racialized stereotypes basically by et cetera, et cetera. So just wondering if a strategy about working with, you know, so.
I think what you're sort of pointing out the importance of is, I mean, there's media literacy, but you're also really emphasizing the importance of media literacy that really responds to particular people's needs. And I think that's so important. I think it's important along with regulation. I don't think media literacy on its own is enough, but I do think that the kinds of strategies that you're pointing to as a part of all of this resources that are now being put into media literacy is very important. Do any of our panelists have anything final to add, or thank you so much for all of your comments. This has been just fascinating. It's been a longer panel, but for me anyway, it's just whizzed by. Thank you, Leslie, for your wonderful
Well, it's
moderation.
also, it's done what we wanted it to do. We wanted a conversation, and we wanted interaction with the audience, the other participants. So thank you very much for the great questions too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
No, it worked well.
Yeah,
It worked well.